Welcome to episode 12 of our reflections on the Psalms. And if you'd have just watched episode 11, David is right back in the same place here. It almost is like nothing has changed. Doesn't tough times feel exactly like that? You do all that praying, you do all that studying, you do all that trusting, you do all that confidence building, you do all that leaning on God, and yet you wake up the next morning and you are still in the mess. Nothing has changed. And this is David caught again in a difficult place. In fact, you have a strong indication of that when you read the opening verse. The first line should tell you everything. Help! That's what David's saying. He's in such a mess, he needs something to happen. People only shout for help when they feel desperate, don't they? I mean, maybe it's males, we are reluctant to ask for help most of the time. But it's not just men. There's a lot of people very independently minded who feel like to ask for help is a weakness or a sign of incompetence on their part. They don't need it. They can sort themselves out. They can manage things. They will get things online. Asking for help is a way of saying, I have tried everything and I can't figure this out. It's a small word that reflects a huge lot of difficulty and emotion behind it, because the word help tells me that I have exhausted myself. I'm in a place where I need something better, more intelligent, stronger, more insightful than myself to work this and figure this out. This is David saying, God, you are bigger, better, more intelligent than me. I need you to help me out on this. The occasion for this psalm, very much maybe as the last psalm, Saul's pursuing of David, which was about an 8-year period of exile for David. And it caused him no end of problems. Yes, it built him into the man that he became. It actually fortified him to take over the kingdom when Saul tragically died in a battle against the Philistines. But for David, it also brought a whole lot of heartache. I don't think David, as he sat writing his memoirs at the end of his life, would have looked back on that 8 years and saw it all as confidence building and character restoring. I think David would have felt he'd had a few nightmares in those 8 years. And difficult times do that. They do change us and make us bigger, but that is only because of the goodness and the grace of God at work in those moments. But they can leave us with a few scars and a few difficulties. So I'm going to just jump straight in and read this psalm for you. And again, you can follow me, as I've often said. In Psalm 12, it says this: Help, O Lord, for there is no longer anyone who is godly. Now there's a damning statement right at the very beginning. The faithful have disappeared from humankind. You see how dark David's getting here? They utter lies to each other. With flattering lips and double heart they speak. May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that makes great boasts. Those who say, with our tongues we will prevail. Our lips are our own. Who is our master? Because the poor are despoiled, because the needy groan, I will now rise up, says the Lord. I will place them in the safety for which they long. The promises of the Lord are promises that are pure. Silver refined in the furnace on the ground, purified 7 times. You, O Lord, will protect us. You will guard us from this generation forever. On every side the wicked prowl, as vileness is exalted among humankind. He's not painting a great picture, David, is he? When you look at the words that he's saying, he's in a dark place, a desperate place, and he doesn't see a lot of signs of hope around him. And a lot of us can relate to that. When things go wrong, sometimes, and it's probably to our indictment, God is a last cause. We scratch around looking for all other elements that might help us out of this jam, whether that's financial elements, familial elements, certain friendships, our working life, other resources that we've got. And it's almost like when someone suggests prayer, that little knee-jerk heart response is, really? Has it really come to that? Almost like prayer is only for the desperate moments. The rest of the time, God's given me a brain and two hands, I can work this out. That's not the issue. David is talking about the mysteries of tough times. And the mystery is that something is always going on around you, and more importantly, going on in you. The person in the crisis, from God's perspective, is always more important than the crisis itself. You've got to get that. Because of that, sometimes the crisis has got to get worse. It's got to get stickier. It's got to get more difficult. It's got to get more resilient. Why? Because there's just something in me or in you that needs a kind of quantum leap to change. And the toughest of moments is the only way that that's going to move. God is always more interested in you than in the crisis you're in. And that's the important thing I think David learns and relearns throughout the Psalms. So there's a problem here. Help, he says. In verse 4, he talks about that problem being compounded by the arrogance of those who speak like there is no God and who is our master. So there's a difficulty. But David will move on from verse 5 and begin to discover the answer. And sometimes there's a long gap between verses 4 and 5. We think we read this psalm and David goes, problem, answer, confidence. There you go. It can all be done in a single prayer session. But the psalm is looking back and reflecting a journey that David has experienced. He can go from despair to hope in a matter of verses. But in reality, he's spanning what was 12 months, 15 months, 3 years of his life. He's looking back over a part of it. And with hindsight, he's able to see and trace the hand of God. But when he was in it, it was extremely dark and extremely despairing and hopeless. So he's reflecting back and he talks about the judgment and the protection and the promises of God that were part of the ladder, the rungs on the ladder, that helped him to crawl out of this quagmire. And then at the end, of course, verse 7, he is full of confidence. But this is David, isn't it? This is so typical of the Psalms. David does get to a place of confidence. And listen, when we are trusting in God, verse 7 is always on the horizon. There's always a place of confidence when we trust. So let us look at this problem. David says, help. There's no longer anyone who is godly. That's a bit of a wild statement. And you hear that echoed. There should be a little bell of familiarity as you read that, because he's not the only one to have felt like that. I'm talking about Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Do you remember when Jezebel was hot on his heels? Elijah runs off into the wilderness and God catches up with him and says, what are you doing here? And he says, I am the only one left. You know, all the prophets are gone. There is nobody left. I am the only godly person here. David says, help, there's no longer anyone who's godly. I'm assuming he's not including himself in that. So David is doing an Elijah. I'm the only guy left who gives a rip about God. Nobody else does. They're full of flattery and lying tongues and double-heartedness and blah, blah, blah. Isaiah, in Isaiah 57, verse 1 says, the righteous man perishes and no man takes it to heart. You see, nobody cares. Nobody cares about the godly because we're such a bedraggled minority. It's the same thinking. Micah in chapter 7 and verse 2 of his prophecy says this, there is no upright person among men. You see how each of the prophets drew all to this place of despair where they think like there is just nobody around we can trust. Nobody who seeks God. These are the low points because it's effectively saying, no one's going to help me. No one understands me. No one's like me. You know, this is just dismal. And so the word help, David's saying, why? Because he can't fix this. He can't outsmart this. He can't outthink this. He can't ignore it either. He can't fight it. Anne Lamott wrote a lovely little book simply entitled Help, Wow, Thanks. 3 words. She says in the book, those 3 words basically encapsulate what is the core of honest prayer. Wow is when we get to the answer. Thanks is living in that appreciation of that. But the first word she says is help. And all prayer ultimately contains that little word. And David is desperate because he talks about in verse 2 people of lying and double-heartedness. In verse 3, flattery and boasting. There's no trustworthy advice. There's no sound alternatives. The whole thing's a mess. He's not just a guy in a dark room with one or two doors to choose from, but even the doors themselves have got faulty handles. David can't see a way out of this. He is stuck. He is trapped in this moment. He's trying to articulate a time in his life when he genuinely felt the game was up, that he had very few alternatives. No one was on his side. No one was speaking for him. No one was protecting him. All he had was God, and the whole thing was going to hell in a handcart, really. But verse 5, suddenly he begins to see a different perspective. Ultimately, that is the key for all of us when we come to this place. Now, the book of Judges is a wonderful example of this, because the book of Judges is really a book of God's deliverance, but it's a Groundhog Day book. If you've ever read it through, and I've read it through on a number of occasions, and every time I read it, I don't think I've ever failed to feel frustrated as I read of these Israelites. They're in a jam, they're in a mess. They moan and they groan and they ask God. God sends them a judge. The judge leads them in deliverance and conquering the very enemy that's caused them to moan and groan. They have a period of peace, and then it all goes south again. And they groan and they moan again, and another judge is sent, and it's just the cycle goes round and round and round. It's Groundhog Day, the whole book. And part of you, as you're reading it, thinks, good grief, when are they going to get the message? When are they going to know that they have to behave differently? Or at least they can trust God. He will come through for them. But that's me. That's you, isn't it? We do the Groundhog Day. Well, we love God when times are great, and then we're very quick to complain and talk about God not being caring. And every time we hear a testimony of someone being delivered or healed or blessed, it kind of angsts us a bit, because we sit there and it just reminds us of the blessing we're not getting, the healing we've not had, the situation we've not seen changed. Why is it other people get it and we don't? Or maybe it's because I'm just not godly enough. I'm not. You see, we do this Groundhog Day cycle over and over again, and probably God gets us frustrated with us, as I would get reading the book of Judges, thinking, why don't they get the message? There is no such thing as a cookie-cutter method of God treating me and you. I don't care if I'm sat listening to a guy talking about how God has blessed him 1,001 different ways, even before he gets up and have his first coffee. I'm not bothered about reading a paperback book. It's just eulogizing over the deliverance of God and how good God is if I'm going in through a real mess of a time in my life. Because the reality is this: I'm not the guy in the paperback book. I'm not the guy on the platform. I'm not anybody. I'm me. And because I'm me, God has to deal with me in a me way. He has to deal with me very uniquely. And so, yes, I may go through 10 times the trouble as my neighbor. I may take 3 months to 5 years longer to get out of it than the guy next door. But that's because I'm me, and him's him, and you're you. And every time God works with us, he has to do it uniquely, customized to not only the person we are, but the way we learn, the way we absorb stuff, the way we process stuff. Sometimes God has to allow David to be in exile for 8 years. David could have said, you know, God, after 2 years, I've pretty much got the message. Let's move on. But 8 years of difficulty. And for some of us, we can spend years in a dark tunnel. And it's a way of saying, why, God? Why? But the reality is, it's based on who we are, where we are, and what is essential for our own lives. And David discovers that. The moral of the story with Judges is people go wrong, but God always responds. Not immediately. So let's get it out of our head that a quick promise in the scriptures, a quick prayer in the Bible, a quick phone call with a friend is going to turn everything around. Because sometimes it doesn't. And if it does, it's because God knew that at this given point, you only needed a month of tough times, a week, a bad day, and God was going to sort the rest. Now, here's the thing. In verse 5, we read these words together. Because the poor are despoiled, because the needy groans, I will rise up. It's almost as if God's saying, Okay, to a point, I'm going to allow this, but then I'm going to rise up. Elijah is fleeing and he's exiled before Jezebel, and at that point, God rises up. And of course, the argument could always be, why do you have to wait for the needy and the poor to get so oppressed? Then you speak. Why do you have to wait until Elijah is tailing it into the wilderness and scared out of his wits and hiding somewhere in some cave before you actually speak to him? I don't know. There's your answer. I don't know. I don't know why God takes a day longer than he should, a year longer than he should, other than what we've said, that there is purpose in that waiting. Romans 8 talks about being enlarged in the waiting. The whole of creation, it says, is now groaning for the day of its liberation. Why, oh why does God just come and liberate it? There is purpose. There is a divine plan going on here. This isn't God ad hoc reacting to people. God is not a reactor. God is a proactor. God does not respond to crisis. He creates problems. He creates solutions. He creates paths through. The thought that God is just kind of looking at history and thinking, whoops, I didn't see that coming, I better do something about that. God is totally in control. This is where David picks up about the judgment of God and the protection of God. He's absolutely certain of these. Why? Because the promises of God, as he said in verse 6, are pure, absolutely, without fault, without hypocrisy, without error. Interestingly, he uses the phrase that God, it is silver purified 7 times. That's an unusual thing to say. I don't think he said that before, David. Why does he say it here? He's referring to a kind of a purifying process known by the ancients that was guaranteed to exact absolute 100% purity from silver. David says God's promises are like silver refined 7 times. They have not got a single speck of uncertainty or flattery or deceit within them. This is David telling himself that the God he's trusting in has promises that are absolutely rock solid. There is no shadow in them. There is no potential hint of any fault in them. David is secure and solid in the promise of God, which brings you right back to verse 7 and 8, the end of this psalm. Where is David? Well, of course, he's in a place of fantastic confidence. He's in a place of confidence because he's trusting in a God whose word is 7 times pure. It is absolutely reliable. Listen to what David says. You, O Lord, will protect us. This is not what he was saying in verse 1, isn't it? Help! There's nobody left. There's no godly person. It's all going south. What are we going to do? Now he's saying, you will, Lord, protect us. You will guard us from this generation forever. He has suddenly got this incredible confidence and surety to make a bold statement. And of course, the temptation is to think, oh, David must have worked God out. He must have worked out the situation. He must have gained an element of control of it and realizes that, this isn't as bad as I thought. I can work this out. I don't think that's what's going on at all. I don't think David understands what's going on at this point. I don't think he feels he can control this thing at all. I don't think he even sees God beginning to control and sort this thing out. But nevertheless, he is willing to trust. See what he says? You will protect us. You will guard us from this generation. That is certainty. That's not David said, I'm hoping, I'm thinking, you may do, with a bit of luck. David is certain. Why? Because he's reminding himself of the great promises of God and the character of God and the nature of God. I'm old enough to remember the Margaret Thatcher years in this country, and especially in the Conservative Party speech that she made back in 1980, in fact in the October of that year. And I can remember that immortal line when pressed about the economy and especially about some of the measures she'd taken even from within her own party. She stood up and told the party, the lady's not for turning. Do you remember that? It cemented her reputation as the Iron Lady. Now, whether you're Labour or Tory or whatever you vote's irrelevant really. You have to admire a strength of character that can stand amidst fantastic pressure and declare, I ain't changing, I ain't turning. Why? Because far beyond the environment that she was in, Margaret Thatcher was Margaret Thatcher. And what she held to, what she believed, not only built her career, but it sustained her in the times when that career was the most tested. It echoes something that God says in Malachi 3:6. I am the Lord, I change not. God's not for turning. And so even when we're in the worst possible moments, David says, I can trust God. Why? Because he ain't for turning. He ain't going to change. He ain't going to double back on me. He ain't going to become weaker or become worse or whatever. He's God. God is God. And God's good. And God's just. And God's love. And God's right. And God knows. And God sees. And God examines. And because of that, David says, he ain't for turning. I can trust him. So even though David's in a difficult place, he's saying, you will, God. Why? Because that's what you do. You will protect, you will guard. Why? Because that's what you do. God will be God, irrespective of the circumstances. And that was David's hope. Because if for any moment David doubted that God would be God, then he would panic. If something outside of God had the ability to turn him, even if it was half a millimeter, it would set the whole of the universe and life off kilter. But because God cannot be changed, he cannot be moved, he cannot be turned, we can return again and again to that absolute rock solid granite foundation that enables us to live life with great confidence, even when the circumstances would certainly dictate otherwise. Let me encourage you to take a hold of this psalm, maybe reread it, and think it through, and allow the very same confidence David felt to begin to seep into your bones and give you a sense of great hope, even though you may be in a real difficult place at the moment. God bless you.